Thank you everybody for joining us, and good morning and welcome to this Office for Product Safety and Standards event where we're going to walk through the new approach to furniture fire safety. I'm joined here by my colleague Sean Ballou, and my name is Richard Jude, and also our colleagues Kate and Ratan are with us in the room looking at the chat and looking at the questions that are coming in today. This session is designed to kind of support your understanding of the new approach proposals and give us an opportunity to walk through the thinking behind some of those, and we're going to go through the full suite of proposals this morning. We're going to do some housekeeping first of all. Thanks for that, Sean. The event is designed and planned to last for roughly an hour and a half. We'll be presenting for the first hour or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for Kate to pick up some of the themes in the Q&A and for us to answer some of those questions. We've designed the session like this today because we've got a lot to get through. There's an awful lot in the presentation, and there's an awful lot of people that we're expecting to join this call this morning. I can see that we're already up towards 70 attendees. So first of all, before we get on to the what we are going to present, I'm going to hand over to our Deputy Director, Tony Thomas, who's going to give us a few words about the project.
Thanks, Richard, and welcome everyone. As Richard says, I'm Tony Thomas. I head up the product safety policy team within the Department for Business and Trade, and really happy to be joining today in what is one of a long list of engagement opportunities, and I know we've had some really good feedback so far from stakeholders, so really looking forward to seeing what people have got to say today. As many of you will know, OPSS is the national regulator sitting within the Department for Business and Trade. It gives us a real unique opportunity from policy through to delivery. So we work with ministers to develop the policy and draft the legislation, but also have the opportunity to carry out regulatory activities as well. So really taking us through the whole process, and this consultation is part of that to ensure that we get those regulations right. And you'll see that we've published those draft regulations alongside the consultation documents so that people can see the detail as well as the questions. This consultation fits with a wider government programme around smarter regulation. So regulation is not a bad thing in of itself, and is really important as a trade enabler when it's effective and targeted. So this very much fits within that banner and is part of the wider product safety review, which some of you will have seen, which was published at the same time. I would encourage you to read that too. The skill sets and the knowledge that we have on this call from stakeholders will be just as important and helpful in helping us shape the fundamental framework on which all of these sector-specific regulations sit, making sure that we're ready for the risks and the challenges of the digital age and the 21st century. The furniture fire safety regulations and the consultation document that we're talking about today, as I said, forms part of that. It takes a very similar approach, ensuring that we keep consumers safe while also supporting businesses to innovate, to grow in a safe way. Obviously, as many of you on this call will know, this has been going on for a very long time, and thank you in advance for all of the input that stakeholders have provided over the last few years in helping us shape this position. We obviously are keen to get any final thoughts as part of this consultation process before we lay final legislation, so please do ask as many questions as you like, and we will seek to answer as many of them as we can today through Richard and Sean, but we will obviously come back to you afterwards with a more comprehensive Q&A. But without further waffle from me, I will hand back to Richard and Sean, who are going to take you through the detail of the consultation. Richard.
Thanks very much, Tony. And by the magic of Teams, my face should reappear in a second and show some of the slides. Thank you, Ratan. As you can see on the slide that's still on the screen there, we've selected each of the key themes within the new approach, and we're going to kind of take you through those one by one after some background and some policy objectives. So next slide, please, Sean. So just to set a bit of the scene, I'm sure most people on the call will be aware, but for anyone who isn't, the existing regime is the 1988 Furniture and Furnishings Fire Safety Regulations, which were introduced to respond to an increasing number of fire-related deaths in UK homes in that period from 1960 up to the late 80s. And what the 88 regulations do is they set flammability requirements for cover material and filling material in upholstered products. And while they do not mandate the use of chemical flame retardants, it's accepted by government, industry, and those who are aware of the regulations that it is the most effective, or most cost-effective and most common method by which businesses meet those requirements. Following a number of reviews and 2 previous consultations, the government has announced that a new approach would be developed, and that is what we're presenting to you today. And that new approach will hope to strike a better balance between continuing to protect consumers from fire-related incidents and maintaining the fire safety products, while also better balancing that risk to exposure of potentially harmful chemicals. And the new approach was recommended by an expert panel, which included chief scientific advisors from across government, and is designed to bring product safety, or bring furniture fire safety in line with other modern approaches to product safety. And as Tony mentioned there, we've also got an ongoing review of the full UK product safety framework, and it's important to consider this in the context of that. But we should note, crucially, that while government is reviewing the framework and consulting with stakeholders on the future of that framework as a whole, the decision has been taken that we should continue with this project to bring the new approach in. And it also gives an opportunity for us to signal some of the ideas and themes in the product safety review of having a proportionate approach to product safety regulation. The next slide, please. And then the detail of the new approach. So as I mentioned, it was announced in 2019 in the government response to the 2016 consultation by then Minister Kelly Tolhurst, and it was recommended by that advisory panel. And what the advisory panel decided is that we should create something based on high-level safety outcomes for the final product, rather than continuing to focus on component-based regulation and assuming that that leads to safe final products. The new approach will be supported, or we endeavour for it to be supported by voluntary British standards that are currently under creation by the British Standards Committee FW6. Since 2019, when that was announced, we've been considering stakeholder views, reviewing the evidence base as it exists and it existed at that stage, and commissioning further research to fill in evidence gaps to support ministerial decisions. And that includes the fire risk of upholstered products piece of research that was commissioned and carried out by a consortium led by the University of Central Lancashire, and that has formed a lot of the thinking around scope of the legislation. The next slide, please. So we've got a set of policy objectives, and the first and most important one of those objectives is to maintain and improve fire safety. By that we mean that we want to ensure that there are no increased deaths and injuries linked to upholstered furniture fires as a result of implementing the new approach. That's what we mean by maintain, and by improve we mean we want to move towards this final item assessment, where we better consider the impact of the product in the home rather than assuming safety based on component testing, but also ensuring that the testing regime that underpins the regulations reflects new and emerging hazards and ignition sources such as lithium-ion batteries. Second policy objective, which is enable and encourage a reduction in the use of chemical flame retardants. It's clear that over the course of the last few decades, the evidence has been put forward by stakeholders to show that chemical flame retardants are increasingly a cause for concern, and this includes the Environmental Audit Committee's inquiry into toxic chemicals in everyday life, where they made a number of recommendations linked to the furniture and furnishings fire safety regulations. And there are concerns about the health and safety impacts of chemical flame retardants, but also the impact on the environment. And it's probably worth noting that a number of chemicals that were previously used in upholstered furniture have since been banned or restricted under broader chemical legislation. So that's why we're acting in this space. And third one is reducing regulatory barriers to bringing innovative products to market. By having the standards and the tests embedded within the legislation, there is only kind of one route of compliance, and we're hoping by having the higher level approach underpinned by voluntary standards and enabling businesses to kind of search for other routes of compliance that are appropriate to meet the essential safety requirements, that will be supporting businesses to kind of think about alternate routes of compliance. And the fourth one, this is about reducing non-compliance by giving greater certainty to business and enforcement officials. We're thinking about things such as the scope of the regulations where ambiguity currently exists. One example that I like to draw on is pet beds. If you were to go to a number of stores and look at the pet beds on sale, some businesses have pet beds that are listed as complying with the 88 regulations, and others choose not to comply with it because their assessment is that those products don't need to comply. And we want to remove ambiguity in spaces like that. And then finally, on this policy objective slide, again, it's about supporting enforcement. We're hoping to improve traceability by introducing new measures linked to the label, but also linked to the technical file, that will ensure that information relating to chemicals, but also who the different actors in the supply chain are, passes along that supply chain better. And now to move on to the sort of the meat of the presentation, we're going to start with the scope, and specifically this will break down into the who must meet the regulations, what products are in scope of the regulations, and in which settings the regulations apply. So we'll start with the who, I think. Sure. Broken down into sort of economic operators, which is a model that businesses and regulators who work with other pieces of product safety legislation like toys, cosmetics, electrical equipment will be very familiar with. Manufacturers of the product, importers of the product have the most burdensome obligations. And then where the term distributor is used, we have introduced a new term called further suppliers, which reflects the breadth of the furniture and furnishings fire safety regulations, as well as sort of traditional retailers. It also encompasses requirements on landlords who supply furniture as part of a rental agreement, which is consistent with 88, but we wanted to make that clearer in the new approach. And then also the first three are specifically about kind of new products. And then also we've got reupholsterers and products that are reupholstered and repaired, and the supply of products during that components during that process, and then also the suppliers of second-hand products, whether they've been reupholstered or not. And then we come to the products in scope. Whereas previously there was a non-exhaustive list in the 88 regulations, that posed a lot of issues in terms of trying to assess what is similar to the products listed there, and didn't account for products coming to market that didn't meet the description of those products later on. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to create a definition that initially encompasses every single product that might meet that definition, and then a list of exclusions where those products should not actually be in scope. And we've started with a definition for upholstered, which is a product which is wholly or partly composed of cover material and filling material, as is set out on the slide there. And then that defines the definition of an upholstered product, which is any furniture or furnishing used by a person or a pet, primarily designed for use in domestic premises, which is upholstered. And this applies to new products, second-hand products, reupholstered products, and initially to outdoor upholstered products, although it is worth saying that we'll come on to discuss outdoor upholstered products and the proposed policy to that in more detail later, because there's a significant caveat there. And then when we move past the kind of the definition of what's in, you're probably thinking there's lots that are in scope of that. That's very, very broad. We then need to move to our exclusion list and our different groups of exclusions. We've considered a range of evidence as we come up with the exclusions, including talking to stakeholders, including the fire brigade and other senior colleagues who have strong opinions on what should be and shouldn't be in scope, but also have the kind of the evidence base to back that up. We also considered the recommendations of the Environmental Audit Committee and the research that we commissioned. And the first category that we've got is in the blue box there, which is products that were already excluded from the 1988 regulations and that are not going to come into scope. We were discussing the definition for an upholstered product, and we identified that certain items of bedding, certain floor coverings, and certain types of curtain might draw within that definition of an upholstered product if there is both a filling material and a cover. And there is no evidence base to support bringing those products into scope that we've put together. So we want to be specific in the regulations that they continue to be outside of the new approach. And likewise, pre-1950s upholstered products, those products were brought to market originally before the introduction of the highly flammable materials that caused concern in the 60s to 80s, which includes the polyurethane foam. And again, we don't have evidence to support bringing those products into scope, so they will remain out of scope. And then the second box, which should be going onto the screen now, is our pink box. And we've grouped these together and described these as the baby products that are out of scope of the legislation, obviously partly informed by the recommendations of the Environmental Audit Committee and then supported by the piece of research we commissioned led by the University of Central Lancashire. We consider that these products are less of a fire hazard than they are a potential chemical hazard when you consider the two next to each other. And this list of labelled products that we've compiled here is based on the findings of that research and the products that were considered as part of that research. So we look forward to kind of discussing with stakeholders throughout this consultation period whether that is the right list of products, whether some of those definitions are clear or are ambiguous, or whether there are products that aren't currently on that list that ought to be, and we can consider that before we finalise that list of products that meet that pink category there. And then we've got some more exclusions on this page. The orange box there is, again, this is largely linked to that piece of research, and what we've done with certain products is we've set a size cutoff. And the reason that we've done that is because it became clear when we were reviewing the outputs of that research, and based on other input put forward by stakeholders, that certain products cannot be treated homogeneously under the same term. For example, if you think about a beanbag, the beanbag on the screen there is inherently fairly low risk in terms of fire because it's a fairly small product. But we've also seen really, really substantial products that meet the definition of a beanbag that are effectively the size of a two-seater sofa or even larger, which have a much higher fuel load and therefore higher fire risk. And that applies to each of those products on that list there. And the research bears out that there is a range of risk associated with those products. And it's worth saying that we've set those cut-offs primarily based on the research, but we wish to hear feedback again from stakeholders about whether we've got that right. The ornateness of the product, cracks and crevices, and the shape of the product also impacts the fire risk, but we didn't feel that we were able to kind of, in a simple, sensible and clear way, build that into our cut-off, which is why we've gone with size. Next box. So this yellow box is products which do not meet the definition of upholstered products now that we've based it on primarily for use in a domestic setting. So we haven't included them on the list of exclusions in the draft regulations, but they are excluded based on the fact that they don't meet that definition. And also the evidence base that we've got bears out that it's appropriate for us to remove those based on their fire risk versus chemical exposure risk. So wheel-child conveyances like prams and pushchairs are primarily designed to be used outside the home. Car seats are primarily designed to be used in the car rather than the home, and the risk profile of the product reflects that. But equally, we did consider them as part of that research project, so we are confident in our assessment about the kind of fire risk versus chemical exposure risk. And loose and stretch covers, which are on that list there as well. The reason that they're coming out of the scope, or we are proposing they come out of scope, is that they would be applied to products which already need to meet the requirements of legislation, such as sofas and armchairs. So it would be a double regulation there. And then finally, for exclusions, there is an option for the manufacturers of outdoor upholstered products to remove them from the scope and not need to meet the flammability requirements if they choose to label that product with an outdoor upholstered product warning label. And Sean will discuss that in more detail later in the presentation. The next slide, please. So this final slide is about the extent and settings where the new approach applies. Crucially, for most stakeholders, it's the top part of that slide, I think, that it applies right across the United Kingdom, in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, because there are no Windsor framework implications, as there are no equivalent pieces of EU legislation that need to be implemented in Northern Ireland. And then we go on to explain that definition of upholstered premises there, domestic premises there, which shows the settings where, if they are supplied into those settings or supplied for use in those settings, they apply. And that largely thinks about this kind of rental agreement situation that we were talking about earlier. So if you're supplying upholstery for use in a park home, a caravan, or sheltered or long-term supported housing, for example, those products would need to be compliant with the legislation. However, motor caravans and other motor vehicles are excluded because the safety of the upholstery in those products or those settings are regulated by motor vehicle type approval, and houseboats and other ships are regulated by the recreational craft regulations or other shipping requirements. And there's that definition, a clarification at the end, which shows that private dwelling does include holiday homes or cottages or Airbnbs where the whole of the accommodation is rented out and you're effectively using it as a private dwelling for the length of your holiday. But things like hotels or bed and breakfasts, per ton lucky, they would not count because they are commercial settings covered by the regulatory reform fire safety order. And then a quick shout to online marketing in terms of kind of the scope of the legislation. I think what has become clear, certainly over the course of the period of the various reviews of these regulations and during the product safety review, is that consumers are doing more and more of their purchasing online. And what we want to ensure as part of this piece of legislation is that there's an equity of what consumers are able to access in terms of information about their products between seeing the product in a physical shop and buying that product online. So what we've set out is that the information that's on the permanent label of the product, and indeed a permanent label linked to Reupholstery, if applicable, is made available at the point of sale online as well. And I think we've had a few questions about that, so we'll look to work with stakeholders to make sure that's as clear and workable as possible. But what this doesn't do is walk into the territory that the product safety review are considering, which is think about the role of things like online marketplaces. This only captures people who are suppliers. So if you are a supplier under the current framework or under any amended framework, then you'll be captured here. We're not getting into that conversation because that would be a tricky place to kind of try and land while they're doing a considerable piece of work on that. And now we'll move on to the new essential safety requirements. What these essential safety requirements will try and do is they will try and maintain and improve the fire safety of the product while shifting to this kind of final item approach of ensuring that the final product needs to be safe rather than components. And also we're hoping that it will make sure that the regulations are future-proof to change by not having really specific testing requirements inside the legislation. So, as I say, it's about maintaining and improving fire safety, and the overarching aim of the first two essential safety requirements in particular is about stopping or delay ignition to aid escape or give time, if appropriate, to put that fire out. And that maintains the intent of the existing regime. We've discussed that with stakeholders at length, including the National Fire Chiefs Council, who have agreed with us that it's appropriate to continue to focus on that ignition prevention. We've used very, very simple wording in the essential safety requirements, and we expect that the terms used in the essential safety requirements will be supported by the British standards and also potentially by government guidance where appropriate. So if we have, there's the first two, thanks for that, Sean. First two essential safety requirements, as I say, they address the fire safety of the furniture product. The first one is focused on preventing that final product igniting, or if it should ignite, ensuring that it burns slowly to support and aid escape. We've obviously specified there in the legislation that this should include testing against flaming and non-flaming ignition sources, and we're aware there is a lot of controversy and discussion around the inclusion of the flaming ignition source, and we've heard a lot from stakeholders. But the evidence base that we've got available to us, including outputs from the characteristics of modern domestic fire scenarios report, show that open flame ignition sources continue to be something that is a significant risk in the home, and London Fire Brigade and National Fire Chiefs Council have agreed that open flame ignition source testing is something they would like explicitly referenced within the legislation. And then also it references obviously non-flame ignition sources, which I think we understand to be much less controversial, and we hope that will include those newly emerging, as well as looking at things like cigarettes and cigarette and smoking materials. It would include those emerging risks such as lithium-ion batteries. So the second essential safety requirement, which is already on the screen, this primarily focuses on the foam within products, where there is foam within products. And the reason for addressing foam specifically is we see a scenario where the final product could potentially pass the first essential safety requirement and test linked to the first essential safety requirement while containing unmodified combustible polyurethane foam. And that's not something that we are comfortable with seeing reintroduced into the market as a result of the new approach. And the reason for that is that we feel that even if it can pass the tests identified originally, that doesn't rule out the possibility that foam could at some point during the life of the product, either because of consumer behaviour taking covers off and washing them, or just through wear and tear, become exposed and therefore create a significant fire risk that wasn't assessed at the time the product was first placed on the market. And that essential safety requirement is designed to mitigate that risk. And then finally, the last essential safety requirement, this sets clear expectation that where chemical flame retardants are used, and would only need to be applied where chemical flame retardants are used, that those chemical flame retardants should not jeopardise the safety of the end user and the consumer. And primarily what this means is that obviously any chemicals used need to meet UK chemical law, including UK REACH, but equally it's about ensuring that manufacturers consider all evidence available to them at the time of manufacture that there's not evidence to suggest using that chemical might actually jeopardise the safety of end users. And again, we're working with Committee FW6 to consider what the standard might say and how businesses will meet that requirement in the legislation. And finally, from me, before I hand over to Sean, as I'm sure everybody will be relieved to hear, we have the new approaches flame retardant technology hierarchy, which is part of the package of measures we've introduced to kind of facilitate that reduction in chemical flame retardants and to support businesses to think about alternate routes of compliance. And do you want to put all 4 bullets up on the slide for this one? I think we're doing them all in one go. What it's intended to do is encourage those manufacturers when they're thinking about bringing new products to market to consider if there are alternate ways of making that product compliant before they use chemical flame retardants. They will need to consider using even inherently flame retardant materials or being able to adapt the design of the product to ensure that the product can be fire safe by using less or no chemical flame retardants where possible. And as mentioned on the slide there, and as alluded to with the 3rd essential safety requirement, we're not going to specify chemicals that businesses can or can't use beyond saying that they need to kind of meet the requirements in UK REACH. But we will require manufacturers to evidence that they've been through this process in their technical file. And evidence could include things like costings for different designs of the product, setting out the design process they've been through, or the application of a process map. At which point I will hand over to Sean, who will talk you through a standards, conformity assessment and the testing.
Thank you very much, Richard. So to bring the new approach into line with modern approaches to product safety legislation, we've introduced the concept of conformity assessment to the new approach. What this means is manufacturers must follow a procedure to assess and demonstrate whether their products, in their final form, meet the essential safety requirements before being placed on the market. This will involve testing, of course, the products in their final form or a representative sample of that product in its final form. So to run through the steps involved, the manufacturer must, during the design and manufacture of the product, identify the applicable essential safety requirements, assess that the risks in the design and manufacture process have been addressed, ensure that appropriate internal checks and controls are in place to minimise those risks, ensure that appropriate testing is carried out, and finally, to make an assessment as to whether it is demonstrated that the product is in fact in conformity with the essential safety requirements. And the manufacturer must consider the complexity of the product and the quantity of production when complying with this regulation. And this approach contrasts significantly with current regulations, which sets out prescribed component-based testing in the legislation. So as we've set out, part of the conformity assessment process will involve product testing. Manufacturers must identify designated or other appropriate standards which specify testing that should be carried out on the first product in its final form or a representative sample of the product, and also on the first batch of foam to ensure compliance with the essential safety requirements from the outset, but also periodically where series production occurs to ensure ongoing compliance. The manufacturer must determine how often the periodic testing will be carried out based on the complexity of the product and therefore the likelihood of the product in a series to diverge from conformity, but also based on production volume. This kind of periodic testing is already carried out on mattresses under BS 7177, so it's not an entirely new concept. Testing must be carried out by a laboratory which is accredited against the standard ISO 17025, which addresses general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories by the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, or UCAS as it's more widely known, or an equivalent internationally recognised accreditation body. which addresses the requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. The test labs must have an accreditation schedule that proves that the lab is accredited to carry out the appropriate testing to the required standard. So manufacturers typically use voluntary standards to demonstrate compliance with legal requirements. We are proposing this approach under the new approach. Standards set out the detail of how to comply with the high-level essential safety requirements. Removing the prescriptive testing requirements of the current regime and replacing it with voluntary standards aims to encourage genuine innovation. This recognises there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to testing products in scope, as there is a wide range of products covered by the regulations. For example, sofas are very different from mattresses or scatter cushions. The new standards will aim to support a reduction in the use of chemical flame retardants through final item testing that represents the products being placed on the market, rather than using, and for that testing to take place over combustion modified foam, rather than using the non-combustion modified foam, which is the current requirement and leads to an overuse of chemical flame retardants. As the standard will be voluntary, manufacturers will be able to identify and utilise other test methodologies to demonstrate compliance with the essential safety requirements, should they choose to, and if more appropriate testing methodologies are available for the products that those manufacturers manufacture. The standard will need to point out clearly which requirements in detail shall be covered. So there should be a provision of information showing the relationship between different clauses of the standard and the essential safety requirements set out in the legislation. The Secretary of State will have the opportunity to designate the new British standards as providing a presumption of conformity with the essential safety requirements if it is judged to be appropriate to do so. OPSS has a process in place to assess whether standards put forward for designation cover the relevant essential safety requirements. And a designated standard may not necessarily cover all of the requirements set out in the regulations. Standards can be designated with restriction if the standard has a shortcoming in covering any of the relevant essential safety requirements. So the specific parts of the standard covered by the restriction would not give presumption of conformity with those specified essential requirements. So moving on to product labelling. The purpose of product labelling, as you'll know, is to provide information in respect of the product, and ideally for that information to remain with the product throughout its life. The new permanent label is designed to improve the provision of information for consumers of new and second-hand products, for enforcement officers, for second-hand sellers, and for waste disposal operatives. And this will address the deficiencies of the existing labelling requirements under the current legislation. In terms of providing information for consumers, the Environmental Audit Committee recommended that labels should clearly state if an upholstered furniture product has been treated with chemical flame retardants, and that consumers have the right to know what chemicals are used in the products that they purchase. The proposals are also supported by OPSS's product safety and consumers research, which shows that about half the population are interested in knowing whether or not a product contains chemical flame retardants. This research also revealed that participants felt that information should be displayed as simply and as concisely as possible, and that a majority of those surveyed indicated that they would not seek further information from other sources. Only 2%, interestingly, of consumers surveyed were not interested in information about chemical flame retardants. While some consumers don't understand and will not engage with this information, it will be available for those who wish to consider the information ahead of making purchasing decisions. We expect the inclusion of chemical flame retardant information on product labels to encourage greater uptake in chemical flame retardant free furniture, as has been seen in the context of egg labelling as free range or battery farmed. It pushed consumer purchasing decisions in a certain direction, and the industry followed, thus driving the market away from relying on chemical flame retardants to meet the essential safety requirements, and therefore reducing their overall use and achieving the policy aim of reducing the use of chemical flame retardants. For enforcement, the proposal includes clear supply chain information and traceability information to better enable enforcement officers to trace a product back to its place of manufacture via importers, distributors, and further suppliers. For disposal and reuse, we already know that there are important waste disposal and recycling challenges for upholstered domestic furniture. Having information available on the use of chemical flame retardants contained within a product on the label will support its safe disposal at the end of its life, and also supports recycling and reuse initiatives, enabling the circular economy. The new permanent label will also support the second-hand market by providing information on compliance with the new approach. Chemical flame retardant information on the label will also ensure that second-hand furniture is removed from sale if it includes chemicals which have been banned since the product was originally manufactured. So you'll see on the slide are the text requirements for the new upholstered product permanent label. Manufacturers will be required to ensure that each new product carries a permanent label to indicate compliance with the requirements. The label must include the text on the slide. There'll be no requirement for a display label going forward, and this proposal simplifies the existing long and short label requirements, which have been confusing. Concerns have been expressed by stakeholders that listing the chemical flame retardants may compromise trade secrets or intellectual property, but other businesses that we've spoken to have expressed a willingness to share this information, and it should be noted that proportions of specific chemical flame retardants or the methods in which they have been applied are not being requested, and often this is the crux of the intellectual property that has led to the reticence to provide that information. It is also standard labelling practice to list chemicals or ingredients for cosmetics and food products under associated legislation, so we feel that there is some precedent for this. In terms of reupholstered products, current requirements for reupholstered products are not always clear, and this leads to inconsistent levels of compliance and therefore potentially unsafe and non-compliant products being placed on the market. As we move towards a circular economy and a greater interest in repair and upcycling, whether that be for economic or environmental reasons, it's important that the new approach is clear on the obligations around reupholstery and repair, and that the proposal balances the need to ensure that products are safe whilst not placing unreasonable obligations on reupholsterers, most of whom are one-man bands and small and medium-sized enterprises. So the new approach aims to be much clearer about the responsibility of reupholsterers. The proposals relating to reupholstery and repair reflect the aim of ensuring the upholstered products remain fire safe following reupholstery and repair, while balancing the need to place proportionate obligations on the industry. The proposal only applies to upholstery components supplied by the reupholsterer. It does not apply to any elements of the original product that is retained. This is because it is not possible to carry out testing to assess the fire safety of the final upholstered product after repair or reupholstery, as the testing is destructive in nature, and what we're dealing with here are often one-offs or unique products. The policy applies to traditional, inherently flame retardant materials and synthetic materials that require chemical flame retardant treatment to meet flammability requirements. This should not force reupholsterers to apply chemicals to natural, materials where this is not appropriate. And as such, it's important that supporting standards identify appropriate testing methods to suit all component types. The policy includes upholstery added to products which were not originally upholstered. For example, if you were to turn a wooden table into an upholstered seat, and that seat would then fall into scope of the new approach. This ensures that any newly reupholstered product does not present a fire hazard. If a customer has their own material that they would like to use, then the reupholsterer is not responsible for ensuring that that material complies with the essential safety requirements, as they are not supplying it. It is, however, recommended that reupholsterers inform their customers of the fire risks of using untreated materials and any original upholstery. So this means that the reupholsterer is responsible for ensuring that cover and filling materials that they supply meet the reupholstery essential safety requirements. And like the essential safety requirements for new upholstered products, the aim is to prevent or delay ignition or ensure that components that do ignite self-extinguish or burn slowly. Again, a special mention is given to foam fillings to reflect the particular flammability risk posed by that type of component. And finally, just to say that reupholstery and repair of furniture originally manufactured before 1950 continues to be excluded from scope as per the existing regulations, which has already been explained by Richard earlier in the presentation. So the reupholsterer must carry out an assessment to ensure that the materials, whether that be cover materials or filling materials, that they are supplying as part of the reupholstery or repair service are in conformity with the reupholstery essential safety requirements. The components must be tested against a designated or other standard by an accredited laboratory to evidence that they are compliant. It is not expected that reupholsterers will test or have the material tested. They can continue to source materials that are compliant and have been tested by their suppliers, as they do under the current regime. The reupholsterer is responsible for demonstrating that the materials meet the essential safety requirements, which entails maintaining a copy of the test certificates to show that appropriate component testing has been carried out by an appropriate laboratory. New voluntary British standards will set out the detail of how reupholsterers can comply with the high-level legal requirements in respect of any added upholstery that they supply. The standards would apply to different material combinations, including modern and traditional materials. As we've said already, standards can be designated if they are deemed to demonstrate compliance with the essential safety requirements. Following the conformity assessment process, reupholsterers will be required to affix a permanent label to the product that gives details of the work carried out and which confirms which components have been supplied and that they meet the legal requirements. We propose that the label includes a statement to confirm the use of chemical flame retardants where they have been used in the components. This will primarily support consumer purchasing decisions, waste disposal, second-hand sales, as I've already mentioned. However, we have not proposed a requirement to list those chemical flame retardants used on the label that reupholsterers will apply. It is clear that although the information would be useful, it's clear that as a requirement would be overly burdensome on an industry whose supply chains work very differently from those involved in the supply of new upholstered furniture. The reupholstery permanent labelling also provides traceability and compliance information in respect of any new materials supplied during the course of reupholstery for enforcement purposes. And alongside the requirement to affix a new reupholstery permanent label, we propose that the original permanent label be reaffixed if removed during the reupholstery process. This does not make the reupholsterer liable for the final reupholstered product, but does ensure that the important information contained on that original permanent label is retained and available for traceability, disposal, secondhand sales, etc. So briefly to cover the proposal in respect of secondhand upholstered products. The first wave of OPSS's product safety and consumers research found that upholstered furniture and furnishings are among the items most likely to be purchased second-hand. So we felt that it's really important that second-hand upholstered furniture can be made available, but also that they are made available safely. Current issues affecting second-hand sales include product testing and labelling requirements. The current requirement to retest second-hand products before resupply is destructive and therefore not feasible. This often leads to safe products being sent to landfill, and similarly, products end up in landfill if they are not labelled correctly, and that's a shame. And this policy directly addresses those flaws in the current regime. So any supplier offering second-hand furniture for sale must ensure that the original permanent label, as required under either the Upholstered Furniture Safety Regulations 1980, the 1988 regulations, so the current ones, or the new regulations, is attached. So the second-hand product must have one of those original permanent labels as required by one of those pieces of legislation. This is why we have included a statement on the new permanent label not to remove it from the product. The presence of one of these labels indicates that the product was made in accordance with strict fire safety regulations. If the label is not present, then the product cannot be resupplied on the second-hand market. As well as ensuring that the permanent label remains attached, suppliers of second-hand upholstered products will be asked to inspect the product and ensure that they do not have any reason to believe it would no longer be in conformity with the regime that applied to it when it was manufactured. In practical terms, this means checking for any obvious tears and degradation that would indicate that the product is likely to be a fire safety risk. So, for example, if the seat cushion and the foam within the cushion is exposed, then that's likely to be a fire safety risk and therefore is not appropriate for second-hand sale. The supplier of the second-hand products must also act with due care to ascertain whether the product in question has been reupholstered or repaired. If the reupholstery or repair work has been carried out subsequent to the new approach taking effect, then the product should bear a reupholstery permanent label. If the reupholstery or repair was carried out prior to the new regulations taking effect, there will not be a reupholstery permanent label because that wasn't a requirement prior to the new approach. If this is the case, then the product will be treated as a second-hand product, so it must bear an original permanent label and not have any obvious defects that would indicate that there is a fire risk. Moving on to outdoor upholstered products, the current furniture fire safety regulations apply to outdoor upholstered furniture which is suitable for use in dwellings. As such, outdoor upholstered furniture is often used and stored inside the home. YouGov research commissioned by OPSS found that 34% of people surveyed bring upholstered cushions into the home or an attached garage for storage, and 14% of people surveyed use outdoor upholstered furniture inside the home, for example, in a conservatory. This represents that more than a third of people surveyed who own or use outdoor upholstered furniture at some point bring that furniture into the home either for storage or for use. The findings demonstrate that it would be inappropriate to remove the products completely from scope. We therefore propose that all outdoor upholstered products are in scope of the new regulations. That being said, manufacturers have an option to choose not to meet the requirements of the new approach if the products have an outdoor upholstered product warning label. The idea of that warning label is to warn consumers not to use or store the product inside. This policy carefully manages the fire risk of consumers bringing outdoor products inside for use or storage, but also takes a proportionate approach for outdoor products, recognising that the risks are different for indoor and outdoor products. It also responds to evidence that flame retardants in outdoor products degrade over time when left outside due to weather conditions. Manufacturers who choose this option will have to ensure that their outdoor upholstered products meet the requirements of the General Product Safety Regulations 2005, as with all of the other products which have been removed from scope. And on the slide is the text that the outdoor upholstered product warning label must include. And as you can see, there is a warning not to use or store the product inside. On technical files, the new approach aims to improve traceability information to support regulatory activity. And one way we've done this is to tighten up on the technical file requirements. Manufacturers are responsible for compiling the technical file. In order to place products on the market that they know to be safe and compliant, manufacturers must know what is in those products and therefore be able to share that information along the supply chain and with enforcement authorities. Our understanding is that the majority of the information required under the new approach for the technical file is already available to manufacturers, and organise it in this type of technical file will ensure a consistent approach is taken, which will further aid enforcement officers. We are proposing that manufacturers and importers keep technical files for 10 years. This is in line with other product safety legislation and also better reflects the expected lifespan of large domestic upholstered furniture, such as sofas, chairs and mattresses, than the existing 5-year retention requirement does under the current regime. We've taken the decision not to require reupholsterers to put together a technical file in relation to the reupholstery and repair work that they have carried out, because this would be overly burdensome. However, as set out in the slide, they will be expected to obtain and retain evidence that indicates that the upholstery that they have supplied has been tested and is in conformity with the regulations for a period of 10 years. And I'm handing back over to Richard to cover the implementation and transition period.
Lovely, thanks very much, Sean. So we've been speaking with stakeholders throughout the process of developing the new approach, and they told us that they would greatly benefit from having a period to implement the new approach and transition over to following it. This will help them avoid disruption to supply chains and allow businesses to use up existing stock and continue supplying products during a period before they move over and start meeting those new requirements. Have the next slide, please. We're currently proposing an 18-month transition, but explicitly asking the consultation document whether people feel that that is the right length of time. We kind of foresee 3 separate scenarios there on the slide where the transition period will kind of apply. They're the products that either are not currently in scope or are deemed to not currently be in scope, but will become part of the scope of the new approach. For example, things we put on the slide there, upholstered iPad stands, which are kind of these foam products, which aren't captured by the current regime, and the pet furniture, where there is a kind of different interpretations. And these products can continue to be placed on the market using the existing regime, which in that case would be the General Product Safety Regulations during that transition period, or businesses can move across in that transition to make them under the new regime. Then there's products which are currently in scope of the FFRs, the 88 regulations. And again, those products can continue to be placed on the market under the 88 regulations for the period of the transition. And depending on whether they stay in scope or they are removed from scope of the new approach, businesses can, before the end of the transition, move across to either making them meet the new approach regulations, or if they drop out of scope, again, they'll fall back down to having to only meet GPSR. And then finally, reupholstery and repairs. Reupholsterers who are kind of supplying upholstery as part of the reupholstery process, they can continue to meet the current requirements under the 88 regulations during that transition period before meeting their new requirements under the new approach. In effectively, the policy intent is for businesses to comply with the new regulations as soon as they are able to, but we appreciate that will happen at different speeds for different businesses. And in certain cases, such as baby products, which currently have to meet the 88 regulations, but are proposed to not need to meet the new approach, we see businesses might be able to kind of shift across and more quickly move on to only needing to meet GPSR in that space because of the impact that will have on the products and the way they can market them. So if we have the next slide, please. I think finally, in terms of the breakdown of the policy, we just want to quickly touch on enforcement. We've already mentioned a couple of areas where we're hoping to support enforcement to be carried out in a more efficient way by clarifying the scope and by improving the the traceability requirements, bolstering the technical file and labelling requirements there. If we move on to the next slide, a little bit of context to the enforcement. As with the 88 regulations, enforcement under the new approach will primarily be carried out by local authority trading standards in England, Scotland and Wales, and the District Council Environmental Health teams in Northern Ireland, and OPSS will be the national regulator. The powers and sanctions that are available to regulators are derived from the Consumer Protection Act and also Part 3 of the General Product Safety Regulations. We're not proposing a review of those powers and sanctions or of the Consumer Protection Act because that is captured by the Product Safety Review. But if stakeholders, particularly local authorities, but if stakeholders have feedback about the the powers and sanctions available to regulators at the moment under the Consumer Protection Act, we're happy to take that on board and we can work with colleagues in the Product Safety Review team to ensure that that's considered as part of that broader review. The one thing we are changing within the enforcement regime is extending the period that regulators have to bring forward sanctions and take legal proceedings against businesses from 6 months, which is the current limit, to 12 months, and that is from the date of an offence taking place. Again, we've already had conversations and feedback on this issue. We would like, in an ideal world, to make that 12 months or whatever the period might be from the point that offences are identified, but we are limited by those powers in the Consumer Protection Act. So again, that's something we're feeding into that wider product safety review. We'll have the next slide, please. So this is where are we now and what are the next steps. We will, of course, collate and analyse all of the feedback received during that consultation period, and then we will. And our next job after that is to issue a government response and amend the policy in the light of that feedback, and based on the suggestions received. We will amend those draft regulations, and then we will take them through Parliament and enact the new regime. The key date for stakeholders attending this meeting is the 24th of October. Thank you in advance for those of you who will respond to the consultation. We urge you to. We want to know what your concerns are, what you like, and any suggestions you have about how we might be able to implement slightly different approaches where you have concerns about those proposals. You have the email address to contact, which is on that slide, because that was who invited you to join this session. So now we will move on to a Q&A. It's worth me saying before we move on to that and look at some of the questions we've been receiving. Thank you for everybody who sent in written questions. We received a huge volume of written questions, and we will look to issue some responses that cover all of the themes in those written questions for stakeholders, as promised when we invited you to the session. We won't have time to cover all of those now because of the volume of them, but Kate's been reviewing the Q&A for us and is going to try and pick out some of the themes for us to work through. One question that I spotted and I should have addressed at the start in terms of the slides: we are recording this session and we will make the recording available afterwards via the consultation page or via email, whichever way is available to us, and you'll obviously be able to see the slide deck as part of that. Now, Kate, you should be a bodiless voice for our listeners and viewers, but you've picked out some themes for us that Sean and I are going to try and walk through.
I have. First, I want to big thanks to Richard and Sean for presenting so coherently today and setting out the new approach. I've picked out some of the questions we've received for you to pick up. So we had one earlier on about the role of throws.
Okay.
What the status of throws in the regulations?
Yeah, so I think I did see that particular question pop up. Where it is sold as part of a sofa, if it's sold as part of a final item, then it would at least need to be considered as part of that assessment of the final item of furniture. If it's a separate throw being sold, then I think it would come under that loose and stretch cover category where it's it's actually a separate item, and it doesn't necessarily have a filling material, and therefore would likely drop out of scope. But if the person asking that question sort of has a range of products and they wanted to test them, then more than happy for them to write to us as either separately or as part of their consultation response to discuss that.
Thank you. Another question we had about, can you say a little bit more about what we mean by representative sample in its final form?
Technical? What do you want me to say?
Yeah, that's fine. I think what we want ideally is for the final product as it exists in the home to be tested, but we appreciate that that's has many challenges around it. So what we mean by representative sample is something that reflects that final product in its final form. So we're thinking if there is a way to represent the kind of crevices and the ornateness of the product, that would be ideal, but also the materials that have been used in that final product and the combinations in which they've been used, the way that those materials have been sewn together, the proportions in which they will be used in the final product. So making the sample that is being tested as close to that final product as possible so that it truly reflects the fire safety of that final product once it then exists in the home.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, the very basic shift there is about, rather than just assuming that if you test a fabric and it goes for a standard test and you test the filling and it goes for a standard test, you're considering how those things will act together, but your assessment as a manufacturer of the final product should consider how anything you do to that final product in terms of adding bits and pieces to it and the shape of it, whether that would impact the safety of the product that's placed on the market. We're of course working with test houses to ensure that the testing, there's capability and that there's capacity for any testing that is developed by the BSI committee, and we're working with the BSI committee to ensure that those expectations are kind of captured but are manageable.
Yeah, and we know that happens with mattresses at the moment, but appreciate that it's much easier to do that with mattresses, to do a small mock-up of what will eventually be the final mattress. So, I mean, that I suppose is the gold standard ideal, but yeah, as we've said, we acknowledge that that isn't necessarily doable for all products within the scope of the regulations, but something that brings it as close to that representative sample of that final product, as is the case with mattresses, would be, ideal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We had another comment that it looks quite resource intensive. So I was wondering, we haven't mentioned the impact assessment. So I wonder if it's worth drawing out that stakeholders should comment on the detail in the impact assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. So alongside the consultation document and the set of draft regulations that we published on gov.uk, we've also carried out a consultation phase impact assessment. We were looking at kind of what the businesses do now, what are the costs of compliance currently, and what do we foresee the costs being going forward. And that is not just kind of monetary cost, that's the material cost, that's time resource as well. So yeah, we're very happy to take feedback on that, and in order to kind of finalise the impact assessment before we make changes to the law, we want that feedback on that and encourage stakeholders to get in touch if they disagree with the figures or have more evidence to supply.
And they'll find that impact assessment alongside the consultation.
It's on gov.uk.
Yeah.
So there's a number of questions around UK reach, the speed of UK reach, and will we be requiring manufacturers to provide any greater information, such as on exposure, than they currently need to provide under UK reach?
So shall I start and then you can follow on? So we're not trying to rewrite chemical law. That is very much the responsibility to maintain UK reach and decide how UK reach work is the responsibility of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, who we work with closely. But what we are doing by setting our essential safety requirement is putting a duty on manufacturers to think about the implications of the chemicals they're using. And we're working with Committee FW6 to think about how businesses will show evidence of compliance to that third essential safety requirement on chemical safety. And that might include things like looking at chemical law around the world as part of their evidence base to consider the legality and the safety of those chemicals. But primarily the requirement would be to follow UK reach. I think it's probably just worth saying on top of that, we know that the Environment Agency, on behalf of DEFRA, are carrying out a scoping review of flame retardants, which will inform REACH policy, UK REACH policy going forwards. Did you have anything to add?
No.
So I'm not sure how much you can actually address this comments directly, but a comment's been made about where customers can choose from a choice of 100 fabrics, 4 different fillings, and the complexities in being able to test all that.
Yeah, so we have had conversations, and obviously I think that question came through anonymously, but possibly with that stakeholder, certainly with test houses, about the implications of this shift to final item testing that will mean, rather than carrying out one test for each item of fabric they might use and one test for each item of filling, there is a need to do sort of potentially increased combination testing there, and whether that's the policy intent, what the implications of that are. Now, obviously the policy intent is that we want there to be a real genuine assessment of the safety of that final item, and the best way to do that is to consider how those two components act with each other. If there is a better way to do that, then obviously we're happy to kind of hear feedback and think about sort of what the implications are in terms of their business model, or whether there's like another way that they can ensure that they're kind of covering worst case scenarios and things like that. I think that's what we want to talk to them, because when we spoke to test houses, we had some feedback that suggested you might be able to, like, as part of a large range of cover and filling combinations, you might be able to do testing of some of those cover materials on some of those fillings, and that might be representative of the range. But I think that's up to the manufacturer to make an assessment of. But I think we'd like to sort of keep talking about that to make sure that we land in the right place.
Yeah, and just to add, we've seen evidence that different coloured dyes can have different effects on the flammability of material. So it could be the same material but dyed in different colours, like you say, Kate. Could be 50 different colours made available, and we know that that dye, I'm sure you're aware as well, that dye can have an effect on the flammability. So you know, some judgment will be needed there as to what is a suitable testing regime that covers all of the different flammabilities of those materials once those different coloured dyes have been added to the material. Yeah.
And there's a kind of a related question in terms of reupholsterers about how we will address when the customer provides the fabric for reupholstering as opposed to the reupholsterer providing the fabric, such as football shirts, you know, people. Yeah,
yeah. So, or you know, you may want material that matches your curtains or wallpaper, that kind of thing. What we are proposing is that any material that the customer provides, so therefore the reupholsterer is not providing that as part of their reupholstery repair service, is out of scope. So the reupholsterer does not need to ensure that that material complies with the essential safety requirements. Though we are recommending that the reupholsterer, when they hand that product back over, or when the customer presents that material to be used in their reupholstered furniture item, that they are warned that there is a potential fire safety risk in doing it that way, so that the customer is aware that the materials won't comply with the legislation that would normally apply to upholstered furniture.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, we think it would be disproportionate for there to be an obligation in that situation. But equally, we are also limited by what we're able to do in terms of the powers under the Consumer Protection Act. We were able to regulate supply, but under the Consumer Protection Act, we're not actually able to regulate services. So as well as there being kind of a proportionate approach that means reupholsterers can continue to carry out business, and that area is considered, it's also there are technical implications about what we're able to do as well.
Thank you. A few questions around labelling, and somebody has raised that if you use the label for outdoor use only, this may end up containing unmodified foam, and there then is a risk that unmodified foam might be then used in a building or brought back into a building. So could the ESR for foam still apply to outdoor furniture that is labelled only for outside use?
That's an interesting suggestion and one we'll take away.
Yeah.
But just to perhaps reassure that person somewhat, those products still need to meet the general product safety regulations, and to ensure that those products supply are safe, there are designated or other standards that businesses can use to kind of prove that their product is safe under GPSR. And I think that would probably ensure some level of testing of the foam, which would mean that probably wouldn't need a GPSR. And I think one of the things we can do is we can specify in our guidance where the products are in that kind of falling out due to labelling, how businesses can ensure they are complying with the relevant legislation, and then also support trading standards to kind of enforce against that if appropriate. But we'll take away that suggestion because that's a possible kind of middle ground if that's suitable.
So further questions on have we considered the digital product passports?
Yeah, I mean, the provision of information via a QR code or digitally was discussed when we first spoke to stakeholders back in 2019, 2020. And I think it's something that we all felt was, how things were going across all products sectors, not just furniture fire safety. So something that we have explored. There are a lot of logistical and practical challenges with providing that information, and we're looking for support across government to take on responsibility for that. And at the moment, given the movement in the EU to move toward, to legislate, bring forward legislation on digital product passports, we're hoping that we can work with our colleagues in DEFRA to align with that policy to some extent, or to create something of our own in the UK that doesn't create a divergence issue for businesses that are placing products on the market in the EU and also in the UK, but absolutely recognise that there are so many advantages to providing information digitally, but it's some way away for the time being, and we want to move forward with changes to the existing furniture fire safety regulations more quickly, and in response to evidence that we've collected from consumers about receiving information or having access to information that is simple, easy to access, and of course acknowledging that for some consumers using smartphones or a device to access information is a challenge. So we don't want to exclude any part of society from that information. So we feel that having the information that is required for the product, including information about the use of chemical flame retardants, should be on a physical label for the time being. That there are very few issues in accessing.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that is at the moment our assessment is that is the best way of ensuring that product goes, that information goes through the life cycle of the product with it.
Yeah.
The risk of moving unilaterally and moving to QR codes without some kind of repository for this information is that large businesses would obviously maintain this information be it on their website via a QR code, and there would be no issues. Where if particularly smaller businesses are much more at risk of kind of going out of business over time, we would have a concern that there would be a bit of a disproportionate impact on consumers there if they were buying from local smaller businesses.
Yeah.
If that business goes out of date, you've suddenly you risk that website's no longer being maintained and that information no longer being accessible. So that was part of our concern and the thinking.
And in addition to that, thank you, Richard, but also the reliability of the information that is being put forward on that digital
repository.
Yeah, wherever it's being stored, government would need to make some sort of assessment as to the claims or the information that's been placed on there.
The veracity.
So there is some challenge there about how reliable is that information, and not only will that information continue to exist throughout the product's life, but is all of the information that needs to be on there.
Thank you. And that links into another comment somebody's made about what happens when a business goes out of business and retaining the technical file.
Yeah, so that's one of the really important points about the label there. So at least that information would stay with the product throughout its lifespan. In terms of the technical file, I think it's probably one we need to go and think about in longer time.
It happens across all of the
but it does happen, yeah.
as well. Yeah.
And it's a real challenge. Whilst we can do our best to make sure that there's a real traceability there and throughout the supply chain, we can't mitigate necessarily against businesses going out of business, but we'll think about that one.
Yeah, and no doubt it's something that the product safety review team will look at across all product sectors.
Another question about foam and latex pillows. Are these now exempt?
So yeah, this is one we've heard. I think probably came through in some written questions. Yeah. So at the moment, we have removed pillows from scope of the legislation, but maybe we need to do a little bit more thinking there, and we really would appreciate sort of feedback from stakeholders if they have concerns about that, and whether we should only exempt pillows that aren't made of foam, for example. So at the moment, all pillows are out of scope for these proposals, but we have had some feedback on this already and would welcome more. Okay, thank you.
A question around foreseeable use and the lifespan of the product. Could you give some thinking about your placing on the market versus foreseeable use?
Well, it's a challenge, isn't it? And it's difficult to regulate for the lifespan of a product. But within our essential safety requirement, we have attempted to address that by talking about that foreseeable use. And that just means that manufacturers should be really considering and producing an evidence base to support the way they're making the product compliant, and assessing the likelihood of it staying compliant.
Yeah.
But it's really difficult for that to be kind of regulated, because all products of all different types of consumer products, they change over time. And it's difficult to kind of regulate for down the line. So the best place to start is ensuring that safe products are placed on the market. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, in terms of moving away from the use of chemical flame retardants to meet the requirements of the regulations, if there is a greater uptake in using design or inherently flame retardant materials, then the concerns about those chemicals migrating out of the product over time, and therefore that product no longer being in conformity with the regulations, is minimised.
But we have to be careful, I think, about having really, really specific long-term requirements, because that could actually lead to more chemicals being used rather than less, which is obviously something we don't want to encourage. So it's a real challenging balance to strike.
And kind of on a similar thing, there's a comment about how can we reconcile moving towards chemical flame retardant free, but having an ESR on foam might mean chemical flame retardants will still need to be used.
Yeah, again, this is really, really challenging, and we've had similar feedback from stakeholders already. At the moment, in our conversations, particularly with fire chiefs and other stakeholders who work with fire, the concern is that we cannot have a regime that would potentially lead to that unmodified foam coming back onto the market. That doesn't stop manufacturers searching for other filling materials to meet the requirements, and particularly if customers increasingly want to look for chemical-free alternatives, and they're driven by kind of what products consumers want to purchase. But if stakeholders have feedback in that space, again, please put it in the consultation responses. Did you have anything to add to that one, Sean?
No.
It's just very challenging, and we want to hear the feedback on it.
So a question about will the proposals suddenly lead to a large number of products needing to be disposed of?
I think not. I think, well, firstly, the transition period will hopefully, and again, we need your feedback on whether we've got the time frame for that correct, will hopefully enable businesses to use up any stock that has started its production journey under the existing regime, and therefore is being made to comply with the existing outgoing regime, but those products can still be placed on the market during the transition period, hopefully, so that that stock of products can be wound down before winding up to producing products in compliance with the new approach. So I mean, that's one way of
Absolutely.
kind of avoid that.
And for products already sold, obviously these requirements are not retrospective, so it doesn't mean that products can no longer be supplied. And actually, what we're trying to do with our second-hand regime here is shift away from some of the concerns we've seen in current practice now, which is this requirement for products to have both the permanent label and the display label, which we know almost immediately gets cut off by most consumers because it's pretty unsightly and it's supposed to be on display. By only requiring products under the old regime that were placed on the market under the old regime to need that permanent label in order for resupply, unless there's evidence that the product might come out of conformity because it's been mistreated or face kind of stains and just kind of is very old. So we're hoping that that will support the supply of second-hand products, but happy to kind of take feedback on that.
Thank you. So another question about why are we not addressing smoke toxicity through the new approach?
Yeah, I mean that's a challenging one. The key is, and the starting space for the new approach, much like the 1988 regulations, is about preventing ignition rather than reflecting and assessing risk post-ignition. And that is the approach that we've agreed with sort of senior colleagues and senior stakeholders like fire chiefs. So that's the reason that we're going down that approach. And if we were to completely rewrite the rule book, it would pose a very long-term challenge, I think.
Yeah, and I think that there's appetite amongst us all to deliver a new approach as soon as possible. And I think taking on the challenge of regulating for smoke toxicity would have delayed us being able to put forward proposals for a new approach somewhat. But as Richard said, something that we are considering and that many of you have raised as an issue. It's also something that we're discussing with colleagues in DLUC who have begun a project looking into the smoke toxicity of construction products, and that is a project that fell out of the Grenfell inquiry, and so we're liaising with them to understand how we can adopt and do some of what they're doing in that space in terms of products more generally, but also in terms of product furniture fire safety.
And I guess the toxicity risk, as well as kind of listening to the outputs from DLUC there. The new framework that our colleagues in the product safety review team are considering, they're looking to kind of consider hazards as they exist across different products. So if there is evidence that supports kind of general requirements across sectors in relation to smoke toxicity, I'd encourage stakeholders to respond to that consultation as well, because it might be there's sort of general requirements that can be put in place right across the framework that will also support the way we regulate upholstered furniture.
Okay, great. I'm conscious that we're actually quite short of time now, so I'll just pick out some of the key ones. Lots of questions keep coming through, so thank you to everybody. Could you give us an indication of the timeline for the development of the new voluntary British standards? And within that, there's been some comments and questions around addressing fires started by lithium-ion batteries, so that is a different type of ignition source.
Yeah, so first of all, on the timeline for the development of standards, when we first commissioned BSI to reconvene FW6, that was actually done over 2 years ago now. And we were told at that time that while standards making process can be a lengthy time, standards can be developed as little as 18 months. It's in everybody's interest, including the stakeholders on that committee and businesses outside the committee, that standards are developed as soon as possible so that the new approach can be implemented, and that we know how businesses know how to meet the requirements within that new approach. So we're obviously working with the committee to kind of move that forward as quickly as possible, and we hope that the publication of the consultation will support that. And the second point was on lithium-ion batteries.
Different new ignition sources, and as we've seen, such as from e-bikes, etc., iPads.
So that's obviously
new ignition source.
One of the things we're feeding into the committee is that these standards and these tests should reflect the risks and the hazards that exist in the home now. So the consideration should be given by the committee how they can make sure that products are fire safe against those new and emerging hazards, and obviously that one's very much in the news at the moment.
Which is why we've left the essential safety requirements sort of appropriately high level, so that the standards can consider the different flaming and non-flaming ignition sources that are hazards in the home.
Both now and going forward.
Well, and going forward. So by leaving the outcomes the essential safety requirements so high level, standards can actually continue to be developed as new and emerging ignition sources come to light in terms of these new products, lithium-ion batteries and e-scooters, that kind of thing. So we're hoping that this creates a much more agile regime that can adapt to those hazards as and when they come out going forward.
And a question about do we expect the new voluntary standards to be similar to the current 1988 tests as set out in the current schedules?
Not really. In some ways, yes, but in many ways, no. As we were saying, this is about testing the safety of that final item rather than testing components and just assuming that therefore if you have safe components or components that pass tests that makes a safe product. And also we kind of discussed it with FW6. They've got scope to think a bit outside the box in terms of the level of ignition source. So if they can, for example, see a world in which the ignition source is used drop from say a crib 5 to a crib 3, but that we can maintain fire safety, then that's something that we're open to. So it's very much kind of an open question that the FW6 committee are wrestling with.
Okay, we've got 4 minutes left before we get cut off from our meeting. I'll just rattle through 3 very quick ones about how are we protecting SMEs? So particularly this affects the reupholstery industry.
Yeah.
I mean, we've introduced measures which we feel are not overly burdensome, but again, we completely appreciate your feedback on that and the feasibility of actually carrying out those requirements. So, for example, we're not requiring reupholsterers to name the chemical flame retardants that are in any of the materials that they're supplying on the new label.
Well, just to jump in, I know you have more to add to your list, but the other thing is obviously SMEs do make bespoke new products.
Absolutely, yeah.
And whilst people may have noticed we don't address the term bespoke in our proposals, this at the moment reflects our concern that sort of all new products should be fire safe. If stakeholders have proposals and suggestions that will enable us to ensure that bespoke products are safe, then we're looking for feedback on that area in particular, because we've heard that that's something of concern. And
that's also set out in the impact assessment.
It is, yeah, there's definitely a section on SMEs. How it impacts businesses, including small SMEs.
Yes.
And just slightly related to that, can you clarify what we expect when we're saying you must list the chemical flame retardants used? Are we just looking at the name or the percentages or chemical formulas?
I think the names is what we're saying. Percentages, no, because we feel that is perhaps too much information and starts to compromise any intellectual property, and also would make the label even bigger. So we're also thinking about the practical elements of the label as well. Yeah. But again, stakeholders, we want to know what you think is possible to share, and also what that list might look like in terms of how many chemicals are on that list. And also sort of how useful is knowing that information. So waste suppliers, for example, is that chemical name, is that the thing they want to know, and can we keep it at that high level? I think certainly in terms of consumers, chemical symbols are not particularly helpful, so there have to be names. Yeah.
And one last question before I'll hand it back to you, Richard, to wrap up. We've had a comment about definitions, and the example was given, how do we define modified versus unmodified foam? Do you just want to talk about the definitions and how we're seeking comments for clarity and what we mean? So, I mean, we're not within the regulations proposing to actually define foam modified or unmodified foam, because we're not actually saying you can't have that as part of the legislation. It's just about ensuring that foam is safe. But we do have a list of definitions which underpin the legislation and underpin the proposals, and we're looking to seek feedback as part of that. There's a question in the consultation document. So if there are any definitions that you don't agree with or have concerns about, then please feed that in. Or if there are definitions that you feel you would benefit from, again, please shout. I'll wrap it up there. We're at 11:59. I'll hand it back to you. Thanks very much, Kate. Well, so I think that was a really good flavour of some of the questions and queries that people were asking. And I think all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining us this morning. It's been a very productive session from our perspective, even just listening to those questions there. We hope it was useful. We'll make sure that you can kind of see a video recording of the session, so you can kind of watch it again or share with other stakeholders. And we look forward to receiving your written responses. Thank you very much. Right.